All right, so we're going to do a quick little ad read. It's the first one of these for one of our great sponsors here, and then we'll get right into Colin. So this is actually a new product from longtime Laravel sponsor 64 Robots, and it's called Remate, and it's a tool if you're a remote team. It's kind of a tool focused on the idea that you have trust in your team. It's a little different than a lot of the other remote tools that are out there. Really interesting concept to me. This is brand new. They're a fully remote team. So I definitely recommend you check this out. I was poking around with it a little bit already. It looks really good. So yeah, check it out. Laracon.remate.io. They also have an offer in swag related to this, and I believe you get it automatically by going to that URL. So definitely check them out. If you're a remote team, give it a look. Looks really good. So thank you very much to them for sponsoring. And now we shall bring in Colin. We've also updated the schedule on the website. So you can take a look at that. We are going to remove both breaks just to free up a little time there. So we'll be mostly on schedule, but right at laracon.net, you can check out the updated schedule there. All right, Colin, thanks for joining us.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Ready to go?
Yes, do it. Take it over.
All right, so I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and then hopefully everybody can see what we got going on here.
Yep, looks good.
All right, perfect. So let's play this. I'm just going to start a little timer. I need to make sure that I'm on time. All right. Oh, here, just one sec. Just want to move that up to there. All right. So, all right. The importance of practice. Laracon 2020. Oh, so hi. I'm Colin Decarlo. The slide tells you a little bit about me, but if you have been to previous Laracons, you've likely seen me speak before. So that may or may not be because I work for Vehicle. So Vehicle is a software consultancy in Ontario, Canada. We work with other dev teams, helping them build world-class applications. And we primarily use Laravel as our backend PHP framework. We use a mix of Vue and React on the front end when we're building things out that way. So I think we can all agree that 2020 has been a bit of a year. It started off with so much promise too. I mean, the New Year's glasses finally started making sense again. I was really looking forward to the optometry jokes that I was going to be able to make. And we finally had the perfect example that we could use to explain memes to our parents, right? But now it kind of seems like the universe had a different plan for us on this year's trip around the sun. If you're like me, you may have found yourself spending a little bit more time away from others. Now, hopefully we've all found something that works for us that fills that space. Whether it was, baking bread or building raised gardens or playing video games or whatever you found, right? For me, I found that I'm spending a lot more time reflecting on choices that I've made in the past. So this inevitably leads me to wanting to go back in time and just have conversations with myself. So as they say, hindsight is 2020, right? And if I could help pass me out by having some really focused and productive discussions about life, well, that would be great for the both of us. So yeah, hindsight is 2020. And this is 2020, so we probably wouldn't be meeting in a cafe like this, right? It would be more like this. And when I think back to the conversations that I think that I might be having with myself, I keep coming around to this idea of practice. At Vehicle, we've done a lot in the past few years about changing the way that we work. We've placed an emphasis on practice that I can honestly say has opened my eyes to how important it is, and how, at least for me, it wasn't getting the time in my schedule that it deserved. So when I think back to the conversation that I probably have with myself, I think the first conversation I would have would be about the difference between work and practice. So I think that conversation would go a little bit like this. Hey, got a minute? Oh, wait a minute now. Am I on Just for Laugh Gags? Wow, I mean, I completely forgot how distinctive my old accent was. What are you talking about? Okay, so let's not worry about that right now. I want to talk to you about how important practice is and urge you to practice more often. Well, I guess that sounds reasonable. What am I practicing? Well, you're going to be practicing developing software. Oh, wait a minute now. I write software 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. I bet that's more practice than the Leafs get, and they're making a run for the cup this year. You watch. Okay, so let's not get excited here. I think we're just getting confused. You're talking about work, and I'm talking about practice. They're not the same thing. When you're working, there's an inherent push towards delivery. And so your focus should go outwards towards that, delivering software to your clients in a professional manner that uses the tools that you have available to yourself at that moment. Practice, on the other hand, has an inward focus. You're using time to develop new skills, which adds to your tools and builds efficiencies. This allows you to deliver better during work, and it's like a win-win. All right, I see where you're coming from. It's like having a big maple tree in your backyard. It gives you syrup in the spring and shade come summertime. You know, you're like a regular Peter Mansbridge of the CBC. You know, that's a pretty good compliment, and thank you. No problem. Just practice, and I think this is going to be great for us. So yeah, that's what I think the first conversation would be about. It would be about the difference between work and practice. And the main takeaways that I want to highlight here is that work focuses on delivery. And as such, we should complete work using the tools and techniques that we're familiar and competent with. There are times when we just don't know what we're asked to do and we get stuck. And in those times, learning on the job is just another requirement. But the difference is we shouldn't go out of our way to try new things and learn new things during our work time. That's really just what practice is for. You'll find that when you focus on delivering in the way that you know how, there will be time in the day for practice. But that is provided you know how to say, that's enough for today. And that's what I think the next conversation with myself would be about. It would go something like this. Hey, I don't have a lot of time to chat today. I'm vacationing with your family. I do want to check in though and just see how things are going. Oh, things are going pretty good. Now that I understand about work and practice, it seems like I'm able to get more done for my clients and they're loving it. You know, kind of like when you go through the Tim's drive-through and the window lady gives you some day-old Timbits for your dog. And your dog is just so excited because she wasn't expecting anything really. Well, you know, that actually sounds pretty great. So why is this just pretty good? What's up? Well, the thing is, I'm working so much, there just doesn't seem to be time for practice. You know, I figured that something like this might happen. So let me tell you about a tool that I use. It's called Good Day, Great Day. The idea is pretty simple, but it's a really powerful tool. What it does is it helps you pace your work so that your whole day doesn't get consumed by work. The key to Good Day, Great Day is about discipline and scheduling. Let's say, for instance, that my ideal split between work and practice is 80% work and 20% practice. So if I'm at the office for 8 hours and I get a 1 hour lunch, then 80% of my on the clock time is about 5.5 hours. That means that I'm going to be focusing on delivering for my customers about 5.5 hours that day and then practicing for 1.5 hours. Given that I've budgeted 5.5 hours, I ask myself, of the tasks that I have to do today, what do I feel very confident in that I'll be able to complete? And I make that my good day. Then I say, if I complete those tasks, what's the next thing I would get started on? And I make starting that task my great day. If I complete my good day early, then great. I practice more. If I underestimated the effort for my good day, then I'll use my practice time to finish that up. You know, after a few weeks of doing this, you'll get a feel for just how quickly you can actually move. Well, that sounds almost as simple as using the rad to dry out your mitts after a day of sledding. Now you're saying that this works? Trust me, just like the rad, you'll be surprised at how effective this is. And yeah, that's the second conversation I'd probably have with myself, and it's about Good Day, Great Day. It's a really simple and amazingly effective tool that I use to make sure that I get time for work and practice in my day. So the main takeaways on this one again is we need to make sure that we schedule time in our day for both work and practice. If you don't schedule them, they're not going to happen, believe me. The good day is going to be the tasks that you know you'll be able to complete within the time that you've given yourself to work. And then your great day is just going to be the next task that you would start if you still have time in your designated work period. You won't always get here, and that's pretty much the point. It becomes tomorrow's good day. So if I know myself, and I hope that I do, I'm pretty sure that the next conversation would be about how to practice now that we've got time for it. Hey, how's it going? Oh, pretty good. I'm still getting lots of work done, and now I've got time to practice. Well, that sounds great. So how come this is just pretty good? Well, now I'm struggling with not really knowing if I'm getting any better and how to measure my improvement or even what to practice. To be honest, I feel like I'm putting the sled in front of the dogs. You know, I think I can help with this too, but a little differently. We've got this idea at Vehicle, and that's if you can show someone a concept in less time than it would take to explain it, then do that. Show them. So I think what would be a good idea for us right now is we did some practice together. So what I think we can do is we can do this refactoring kata called the Gilded Rose. Now, I love this kata. The story is that there's this shop called the Gilded Rose, and they sell all sorts of items in it. Every night, each item in the inventory is updated, changing its sell-in and quality properties. Different items are updated in different ways, and the store owner wants to start selling new items. But of course, the rules for updating that item are different than the other rules. Now, the code is a big mess of conditional logic, and the refactor that we're going to do is called replace conditional with polymorphism. So by the end of this, instead of having multiple nested ifs, we're going to have individual classes responsible for updating each type of item and a factory for creating these update classes. The specific technique that I'll be practicing is what I call identify and isolate. Now, I've refactored this code lots of times, and I've learned that this technique is really just the most effective way for this type of problem. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and just let me know when you can see it. All right, so this is the code here. And again, this here is that main body of logic with the nested ifs that is responsible for updating all of the items in the Gilded Rose class. So we're going to do this refactor. Now, before I start any task, what I like to do is kind of just make a bulleted list of what it is that I want to accomplish. So the first thing I want to do is I want to ensure that I have 100% code coverage for my tests. Now, this is really important for this specific technique using the identify and isolate. So we got to make sure that we have that. Once we identify that we have 100% code coverage, what we want to do next is pull the main logic of the code that does the updating into a new method. Once we get that, what we want to do is we want to split up the main chunk of code into smaller methods that is specific for each type of item that we're going to be updating. Once we do that, then we'll be in a position where we can start introducing new classes that are specific to each type of item. And then in those new classes, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a new method for updating them. And so we're going to want to move the specific methods, move the methods from this class to the new classes. Then we'll have all of these new classes, but we need a way to access them. So what we're going to do at that point is we're going to make a factory. And then we're going to use the factory. Now, it might seem like a lot to do in the next 18 or so minutes, but we can get through this, believe me. You will see that I'm probably going to use a lot of keyboard shortcuts. Through all the practice that I've been doing, I've learned that using keyboard shortcuts is, it became muscle memory for me. Every time I wanted to use the mouse, I just said, well, what's the shortcut for that? And I learned that. So I installed a plugin that shows the keyboard shortcut that I'm using at the bottom. And so you can watch for that just to make sure that you're kind of like following along as best as you can, okay? So first things first, I want to run my tests to make sure I have 100% code coverage. So I'm going to do that here. And sure enough, we do have 100% code coverage. So you can see we have 100% of our files covered and 100% of our lines. That's good. So that's checked. Now we want to pull the main logic of the code into a new method. So I'm just going to give ourselves a little bit more space here and then hide the coverage because a little bit hard to look at. So this is the main chunk of code here. So I'm going to start collapsing down these bits here to make it easier for me to move things around. All right, so I'm going to use a refactoring tool called extract method. And I'm going to put it in just another method, and I think I'm just going to call it update because that's really what it's doing. Now we haven't really changed our code at this moment, we've just moved it around. But I'm going to run my test just to make sure that things are still good, and they are. So the first thing I want to do now that we've moved the main logic into a new method is start splitting that main chunk of logic into smaller methods that are specific to updating specific items, okay? So the first item that I see is hbree. So let's deal with hbree first. So I'm going to extract this to a constant because I'm not very good at typing, and using constants makes it a little bit easier for me. Now that we've got that hbree there, we need to start doing some branching up in our main loop here, because all we're doing now is just calling update. So I need to introduce a branch that says, just for now, if true, then run the update. I'm going to run my test just to make sure that we haven't broken anything, and we haven't. Now, this if true spot here is where I can say, if the item is of type hbree, then update the hbree. Otherwise, run the regular update method. So let's do that. Let's move that down here and then say, if the item name is equal to agedbree, then let's run a method called update agedbree. Okay, so you'll see the editor is telling me that update hbree doesn't exist yet because it doesn't. So we're going to have to create it. But instead of starting from scratch, I'm just going to use a copy of the update method here. And I'm going to call this update agedbree. Now you might be thinking to yourself, hey, I'm just making more of a mess here. I'm duplicating code everywhere. And it's just really important to understand that when you are doing a refactor, most times things get a lot messier before they get cleaner. So we've got our test passing, we've got a new method called update agedbree. But this is where the coverage comes in really handy. So we did have 100% coverage, but if we run our coverage now, you'll see we're down to 76% of our lines are covered. And that's because there's code in the update agedbree method that just isn't specific to agedbree. And because it's there, it's shown here, I can just start deleting it, really. I don't even have to read it for the most part. I can just start collapsing and start deleting. Now, you'll see though that I am left with some pretty weird looking code. Like I've got this empty if block here. So I can use the editor to just remove that. And then for these ones here where I have an empty block, but then something else in this if else, I find it easy to flip the if else statement so that it makes that change. Now let's just keep looking for more code here that actually doesn't get run and just start moving things around. So here I'm going to flip this again. Just got to move it over a bit. Now, there's a few chunks of code in here as well that is kind of like saying if true. So if the item name is equal to agedbree. Now, we're in the method called update agedbree, so I'm pretty confident the item is going to be agedbree. We can just unwrap this if statement altogether. Now, looking at this is if true, right? If true or something else. So this is always going to be true as well, and this is always going to execute. So we can just unwrap this as well. So what we've done is we've used our coverage to identify and then isolate just the code specific to updating agedbree. Now, if we run our coverage though, you'll see we're not up to 100% yet. And the reason for that is that there's code in the update method that's specific to agedbree that just doesn't execute anymore. So that's going to be down here. So the next job that we actually have to do is start hunting for this type of code and then cleaning up this update method. So here's another spot here. If the item name doesn't equal agedbree, and it can't now because we have a method that's specific for updating agedbree. So we're just going to unwrap this. And then we're going to keep moving through and looking for agedbree. Here's another one here. So if the item name doesn't equal agedbree, again, that's true, right? So because we're doing an and here, whether or not we enter into this block is completely dependent on how this evaluates. So this true doesn't even play into that decision anymore, so we can just remove it. Let's run our test just to make sure we haven't broken anything. And tests are green, which is great. All right, and that's pretty much the steps, I just have to keep washing and repeating now for the different items that this main update method is dealing with. So here's backstage passes to something's concert. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to extract to a constant, and then I'm going to move up into the main logic of our loop here, and I'm going to put this in a condition again. And I'm going to say if true, and just make sure that we haven't broken anything. We haven't. So I'm going to duplicate this line and then move it down, and then say if the item name here is equal to backstage passes, then let's update backstage passes. All right, so again, backstage passes doesn't exist. So we're going to use a copy of the update method for it. Again, instead of starting from scratch. All right, so that should all be good now. So let's run our test just to make sure we haven't broken anything. And now let's run with coverage. So we're at 78% coverage now. And that's again because there's going to be code in our update backstage passes method that isn't specific to updating backstage passes. So again, look for the red and delete. All right, now let's flip this. And then if the name is backstage passes, we can just delete it. So we can unwrap that if. Here's another one. It's right here. If the item name is backstage passes. So let's unwrap that. And then let's flip this around. All right. So again, if the item name is backstage passes, well, we're in the update backstage passes method, so it better be. Let's just delete that. And now what we've done is we've identified and isolated all the code that's specific to updating the backstage passes. Let's run our test to make sure we haven't broken anything, and we haven't. Now let's take a look at the update method. This one's one of my favorites. You'll see here, item name doesn't equal backstage passes, and there's all this red down here. So it will never equal backstage passes now that we have that specific method. So we can unwrap this and it deletes all of that code. Here's another spot here. And now what we've done is we've actually identified and isolated the code that's specific to updating just any other item. So we've got age free, backstage passes, and then any other item. So I've done that step. I've split up, I'm just gonna hide coverage here. I've split up the main logic into smaller methods. So now it's time for new classes. But before we do those new classes, I want to clean this up a little bit. We've got this nested conditional in here. So again, I can just use the editor to merge that into an else if, and it reads a little bit better now. If the item is age free, then update age free. If the item is backstage passes, then update backstage passes. Otherwise, just call this update. So I'm at this point now where I want to start introducing new classes, and those are going to be our polymorphic classes. So I'm going to start writing the code here that I want to exist, even though it doesn't. So I'm going to have inventory items, and in here I'm going to create something called age free. And then that inventory item is going to have an update method on it. Oops, not capital I item. There we go. So I'm going to use the editor again to create this class. So create class, and it's going to drop me into the new age free class I've just made. And I'm going to delete the construct method here. We're not using it. I'm going to flip back to Gilded Rose. Now I'm going to do a bunch of flipping because we're creating these new classes. So I'm going to try my best to say, hey, we're moving to this spot, we're moving to that spot. Now we have to create this method called update that exists in our age free class. And it's going to be a copy of the update age free method. So what I want to do actually is I just want to jump down to update age free and then copy the contents of that method before I come back up to the main loop here and add this method. Now, PHP Storm does have a refactoring called move method, but I kind of find that it's just too smart for me. I'm not that smart of a person. So I just find like copying and pasting over the number of times that I've done this is really the most effective way for moving that method out. So let's flip back to Gilded Rose, and I'm going to comment out the update age free method call and run the test to make sure we haven't broken anything. And we're all green, which is great. And so now I can just delete this call altogether, which means we don't need this method either, and I can delete it. And again, we're just going to wash and repeat for backstage passes. So I'm going to say inventory item equals new backstage passes, and inventory item update. We're going to pass in the item, and I'm going to use the editor again to, well, that's a colon. Oof. I'm going to use backstage passes. I'm going to use the editor to create that backstage passes class. That could have been disastrous. Here we go. Delete that constructor, and I'm going to flip back to Gilded Rose now. Now, again, I'm going to jump down to update backstage passes, and I'm going to copy the body of that method. And I'm going to pop back up to the main loop, and I'm going to ask the editor to add this method to the backstage passes class. And I'm just going to paste that in there. Now, I'm going to flip back to Gilded Rose, and I'm going to comment out the call to update backstage passes and run our test to make sure we're still good. And you can see that we are. So we're in good shape so far. We've got one more to go. Now, I struggled for, oh gosh, a good long time trying to think of a name for this one. And I eventually landed on generic item. Now, generic item, I think, is probably the best name for this, just any other item. So there we go. And again, we're going to create the class and delete the constructor. If anybody knows how to edit this template, I would be really happy. Back to Gilded Rose. And, oh, let's get rid of this backstage passes. Sorry. Now, let's up one more. So let's get rid of that. It's going off the rails here. There we go. Let's copy. So we want to copy the contents of the update method here and move it into generic item. So we're back on track. All right, so we're going to ask the editor to add that method and paste it in there. Now we're going to flip back to Gilded Rose, comment that out, and run our tests, and hopefully we haven't broken anything. No? So we're still good. All right, so we are real close now to actually being done, which is pretty good because I think we're running out of time. What we're going to do now is we've created all those individual classes. So now what we have to do is make the factory. So looking at this code here, this kind of looks like a factory already to me. We're branching on the type of item that we want, and then we're creating a specific class for it and then updating. So if we separate this out from the create the item and then update it, we're going to have our factory. So I'm just going to move this down and then format the code. And then I'm going to delete the other updates here. I'm going to run the test to make sure I haven't broken anything. And there we go. So this here, this chunk of code is a factory method, effectively. So we can just extract it at this point and just give it a generic name of factory. I don't really like that, but that's temporary, so it doesn't matter too much. Again, run our test to make sure we haven't broken anything. And we're back. So now what we have to do is we have to make that factory class. So when I'm naming things, I like to give them names that are kind of specific to the context that they're in. So when I think about updating items in a store, I think, who does that? And for me, it's like the clerk. The clerk goes into the back of the store, and what they do is they pick the item off the shelf. They inspect it, and then they update its value, right? So I'm going to have clerk, and that's going to be our factory, and the clerk is going to pick the item off the shelf. So again, I'm just going to let the editor create this class for me because I'm not too great at typing. You've probably seen already. We're going to flip back to Gilded Rose, and I'm going to copy the contents of this method, and I'm going to put it in the pick method of our clerk. So I'm going to add that here and paste it in. Now you'll notice that there's some undefined constants here, age, breed, and whatnot. That's because right now we're in the clerk, which is our factory class, and these come from the Gilded Rose. So because I just copied and pasted, the editor didn't know and didn't move those for me, so I have to move them myself. So let's go back to the Gilded Rose, and we can use a refactoring in here called move member. So that's just with F6, and we can type clerk and then choose these and then do that refactor. Now, if we go back to our clerk, we'll see that those constants have moved back in, which is pretty great. So back to Gilded Rose, I'm going to comment out this call to the factory and run our tests. And I think that we should be good. And you can see that we are. And so that's great. Now, we've got one last refactor that I want to do before we kind of wrap things up. And you'll see here that we're creating this variable inventory item. I'm not a big fan of that name. And then we're using it immediately just to call update. So there's another refactoring called inline variable that we can use to just clean that up. So now it reads, instantiate our clerk, and for each item that we have, pick the item off the shelf and update it. And that's our refactor right there. So just to recap, for this method, this replace conditional polymorphism, we wanted to make sure that we had 100% code coverage. And then we pulled the main chunk that we wanted to refactor into a new method that just put it in a spot like our work area. Then we split that main logic into smaller methods. And then those smaller methods were moved into new classes. Finally, we made a factory and then used that factory in our method here. So the really important thing is like the original requirement was to add another class of item that we can update. And we don't actually have to change this Gilded Rose anymore. In order to make that, all we have to do is teach our factory to recognize that new type of item and then create a new type of updating class that factory is going to return from us. And we're done. So this really is all about the open-closed principle from solid design, which is really good and really, well, I like using it, as you can see. And I've done all of this practice before, which is why I've been so efficient at using my editor and making these changes and getting through this work. The first time I did it, I used a completely different method called read by refactor, and it took hours. And now we did it in about 20 minutes, which is, well, I think a pretty good improvement, really. All right, so I just want to leave you with one more thought, okay? And that's this. This is the main thing. If you want to be able to do something well when it's important, practice when it isn't, okay? And that's all that I've got today. So I just want to say thanks for your time and thanks for listening. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin.
No problem. Just got to stop this share somehow.
Yep, you're good. You got it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.